Nobody from my family came to my wedding. Not even my parents showed up. The day that should have been the happiest of my life felt strangely hollow. I stood at the back of the hall, clutching my bouquet so tightly that my fingers ached. My dress was perfect, the music soft, the decorations glowing in warm light. Yet my eyes kept drifting to the rows of empty seats near the front. The seats that were supposed to hold the people who raised me. My father, my mother, my siblings. They weren't there. I waited, even stalling for a few minutes before the ceremony began, secretly praying that maybe, just maybe, they'd walk in late. I imagined my father striding in, apologizing, smoothing out his tie as though nothing was wrong. I imagined my mother rushing to fix a loose strand of my hair, kissing my cheek like mothers do. But nothing happened. The doors stayed closed. The music began. The guests stood. I was supposed to feel like a bride stepping into her fairy tale, but instead, I felt like a child abandoned at a school recital all over again. As I walked down the aisle, my legs trembled. I tried to smile, tried to hold my head high, but every whisper from the guests felt like it was about me. They knew. They saw those empty chairs. They were probably asking themselves the same thing I couldn't stop asking. Why weren't they here? My husband, now my husband, was waiting at the altar. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and when I finally reached him, he squeezed my hand so gently, trying to reassure me. For a second, I wanted to sink into his comfort and block out the world. But the humiliation burned too deep. It wasn't just their absence. It was the message behind it. They didn't care. Not enough to show up. Not enough to witness my vows. The ceremony went on, but I barely heard the words. I repeated the vows, my voice shaking, and I tried to focus on his smile. Still, my eyes kept flicking to those glaring empty spaces, like wounds carved into the room. I caught the sympathetic glances of friends who had shown up for me. A cousin gave me a small nod, as if to say, "You're stronger than this." But it didn't stop the ache. It didn't stop the quiet humiliation pooling in my chest like heavy stones. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, the applause filled the room. I kissed him, clinging to him harder than I meant to, as though if I held tight enough, I could forget the people who had chosen to leave me alone on this stage. The reception was a blur. I laughed at jokes, posed for photos, cut the cake, all the while pretending everything was fine. Inside, though, I was screaming. Every toast from a friend reminded me of the words I'd never hear from my parents. Every dance reminded me of the father-daughter dance that would never happen. When the night ended and I was alone with my husband, I cried. I tried to explain that it wasn't just about them missing a wedding. It was about them missing me. About every moment in my life where they'd chosen distance over love. And that night, staring at the ceiling while he held me, I couldn't stop asking myself the same question over and over again. Why wasn't I worth showing up for? Cliffhanger. But the truth behind their absence was even more devastating. The truth behind their absence wasn't just about my wedding day, it was the echo of my entire childhood. When I closed my eyes that night, memories came flooding back. Not the kind that make you smile, but the kind that sting, like reopening a wound you thought had healed. I remembered being 7 years old, standing in the kitchen, holding up a picture I had drawn in school. My mother barely glanced at it before setting it aside. A minute later, my brother came in with a report card. She practically jumped to praise him, calling my father over to see his grades. My drawing. Forgotten, left on the counter, stained later by a spilled glass of juice. That was the story of my life. My siblings were always the stars. My brother, the genius. My sister, the beauty. And me, I was the afterthought. The one they tolerated. The one they compared, always unfavorably. At birthday parties, they made a big deal out of my siblings' gifts, while mine were practical, forgettable. At school plays, they'd wave enthusiastically when my sister stepped on stage, but when my part came, their eyes were elsewhere, distracted. By the time I was a teenager, I stopped expecting attention. Still, I hoped for it. I studied hard. I worked part-time jobs. I got into a good college. When I graduated, cap and gown, I looked into the crowd and saw empty seats. They hadn't bothered to come. My friends' families cheered and clapped, cameras flashing, flowers waiting. Mine. Silence. I smiled in photos, but when I went home that night, I cried myself to sleep. It didn't stop there. Every promotion I earned at work was brushed off as lucky. Every achievement felt small in their eyes, no matter how big it was to me. Nothing I did was ever enough to make them proud. And yet, despite everything, a part of me still believed marriage would change things. That maybe if they saw me as a bride, they would finally see me as valuable. That maybe, standing there in my white dress, they would put aside their coldness and show up for me, just this once. But they didn't. Instead, they left me walking down the aisle alone, proving what, deep down, I had always feared: their absence wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. I lay awake replaying it all. My mother's dismissive tone, my father's disapproving looks, the way my siblings were showered with love while I begged for scraps. My wedding wasn't the first time they had abandoned me. It was just the most visible. I thought back to all the times I had asked, "Why not me? Why can't you love me like you love them?" And the silence I got in return. It felt like my life had been one long rehearsal for this final betrayal. It wasn't about one day. It was about every day before it. Every missed recital, every forgotten birthday, every cruel comparison, every ignored achievement. The wedding was just the loudest echo of a truth I had been running for my whole life. And yet, a part of me still couldn't understand. I kept asking myself, why? Why would parents choose to abandon their own child so completely? Why would they so deliberately cut me out, even on the one day that was supposed to matter most? I didn't know the answer yet. But soon I would. Cliffhanger. Then I discovered the real reason they refused to come. It wasn't silence. It wasn't indifference. It was deliberate. A cousin reached out a week after the wedding, hesitant but unable to keep it to herself. She told me my mother had gone around to relatives, whispering poison. She had called me selfish, ungrateful. She said I had abandoned the family by daring to build a life of my own. My father wasn't any better. He told anyone who would listen that my husband wasn't good enough for me, that he didn't come from the right background, that I was throwing my life away. He made it sound like marrying the man I loved was some kind of betrayal against them. It wasn't that they couldn't make it. It wasn't that something came up. They had chosen to boycott my wedding. Not out of principle, not out of protection, but because it wasn't their decision. The realization hit harder than the empty chairs at my ceremony. My parents didn't want my happiness. They wanted control. And when I dared to step outside their control, they punished me the only way they knew how, with absence. The memories started piecing together like shards of glass. Every time I had tried to make an independent choice, they had shut me down. When I picked a college major they didn't approve of, they mocked me. When I dated someone they didn't like, they froze me out until I caved. Even my hobbies were criticized, wasting time, they'd say. It wasn't about love. It was about power. And on the most important day of my life, they showed me just how little I mattered compared to that power. The sorrow that had been eating me alive shifted into something else. At first, it was disbelief. Then, slowly, it burned hotter. Anger. A righteous anger that made my hands shake, that made my chest feel like it would explode. How dare they? How dare they stand in judgment while I begged for a sliver of their approval my whole life? How dare they tarnish my marriage before it had even begun? How dare they twist my love into something shameful, when all I had wanted was to be happy? The whispers around town, the pitying looks from relatives, suddenly made sense. My family had painted me as a villain, and I had been walking around carrying shame that wasn't even mine to hold. They didn't come because they couldn't stand to see me happy on my own terms. They didn't come because my joy wasn't under their control. That truth seared itself into me. It was ugly. It was painful. But it was also liberating. Because in that moment, for the first time in my life, I stopped asking what was wrong with me. And I started seeing what was wrong with them. Cliffhanger. That's when I decided to stop being their victim. That's when I decided to stop being their victim. I was done letting their absence define me. Done crying into pillows at night, wondering why I wasn't enough. If my own parents couldn't love me the way I deserved, then maybe I had to start by loving myself. So, I began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. My husband and I created our own family traditions, little things that made our world feel whole. Saturday breakfasts at the tiny diner near our apartment. Evening walks where we held hands and planned dreams out loud. Holidays celebrated not with bitterness for what was missing, but with joy for what we were building. It wasn't easy. The silence from my family still hurt, but I started filling it with other voices. I leaned into therapy, finally spilling years of wounds I had carried alone. The therapist told me something that stuck: you can't make people love you by bleeding for them. That sentence replayed in my head for weeks. And every time it did, I felt a little freer. I started journaling, writing down the truth I had never dared to say out loud. The anger, the grief, the humiliation. Page by page, I pulled their claws out of me. And then there were my friends, the ones who did come to the wedding, who clapped the loudest, who hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. The ones who never once asked, "Where's your family?" because they knew the ache was already heavy enough. For the first time, I leaned on them. I let their loyalty matter more than blood that had betrayed me over and over. Little by little, I realized something I had been blind to my whole life. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need my mother's nod to feel beautiful. I didn't need my father's lecture to feel successful. I didn't need my siblings' fake smiles to feel loved. I could choose myself. I could choose peace. So I built walls, not walls of bitterness, but boundaries of survival. No more late-night texts begging for answers. No more holidays spent waiting for a phone call that would never come. No more begging for scraps of love. I thought distance would make me lonelier, but instead, it gave me air to breathe. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I wasn't the scapegoat. I wasn't the girl crying in the shadow of her siblings. I was me. And that was enough. Cliffhanger. But the real test came when my parents tried crawling back. Months had passed. My husband and I had settled into our new home, a place filled with laughter, safety, and the kind of love I had always craved. For the first time in my life, I felt steady, whole. And that's when the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was soft, almost rehearsed. We'd like to reconnect. We heard about the house. About how well you and your husband are doing. For a moment, I froze. My heart wanted to leap, like a child who had waited years for scraps of affection. But another part of me, the stronger part, remembered the empty chairs at my wedding. The whispers. The lies. The silence. This wasn't love. This was convenience. When they showed up at my doorstep a week later, I saw it in their eyes. Not remorse. Not apology. Just entitlement. Like they still believed they had the right to walk in and out of my life on their terms. But I wasn't the same girl they had abandoned. I stood taller. My voice didn't tremble. My hands didn't fidget, waiting for approval. I appreciate you reaching out, I said calmly. But I need you to know something. I don't need you anymore. Not the way I used to. Your absence taught me something I should have learned long ago. My worth doesn't come from you. The words hung heavy in the air. My father blinked like I had spoken in a language he didn't understand. My mother's lips parted, but no defense came. They were shocked, maybe even hurt. But for once, their reaction wasn't my burden to carry. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't hateful. I was free. I smiled, not the desperate smile of a daughter begging to be seen, but the quiet smile of a woman who finally understood her own value. Then I closed the door. And just like that, the weight I had carried my entire life slipped off my shoulders. I didn't just survive their rejection. I grew because of it. I built something they could never take away. Something they would never fully understand, because they chose not to be a part of it. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, loyalty, and the people who show up when it matters most. And mine. My family was already here, beside me, hand in hand. In the end, I didn't just survive their rejection, I built a life they'll never get to witness.